I'm David Murphy. In this short video, I'm going to talk about acting as an academic referee for someone applying for UK clinical psychology training. I've written many references for people applying for clinical psychology training myself, and over the years must have read many thousands of references. If you're watching this video, I'll assume that you've been asked by an applicant to provide a reference to support their application. I'd like to start by saying thank you for agreeing to act as a reference, not just on behalf of the person whose reference you're writing, but on behalf of the clinical psychology training community and the profession as a whole. References play a key part in the selection process, often more so than referees are aware of. I can't make a video like this without pausing just for a moment to say that I personally believe that there are a number of aspects of the process for selection for clinical psychology training at the moment which do not promote diversity and inclusion, and it's an area that I've spoken of about a number of times, and I certainly include the reference aspect of the selection within that. So I think there's certainly aspects of this process that could be improved, and I'm pleased that things are moving now, but I'm not going to, it's not the place for me to go into that here, but this video I'm just focusing on the process as it is now. But I think it's important just to acknowledge that there are things that need to be, in my view, improved about the process to increase equity. In terms of advice for people giving references, I think the most important thing for me to say, and to some extent if you're watching this video you probably don't need me to say it, but is don't take the process lightly. You probably, like me, write job references for people all the time. Every week you're responding to one request or another. This reference is nothing like most of the references that you will be writing. I think there are a couple of things that it's important to understand in terms of why these references are different. The first is that clinical psychology is highly competitive. On average, an individual course receives about, on average, 25 applicants per place. Although on average courses receive about 25 applications for each place, most courses interview only about 3 applicants per place or less. That means that 90% or so of all applicants are not shortlisted, and this decision on shortlisting is based solely on the information courses receive from the clearinghouse, and that information consists of the applicants' academic grades, their employment history, and information they write about themselves, and the reference that you write about them. Now, given that almost all applicants have a 2:1 degree or above, almost all applicants come with relevant experience, it's often the reference that is the most differentiating part of that information. Some courses also rely on online tests as part of the shortlisting process, but those courses, the majority of those courses, still also rely on the references as part of their decision-making process. Courses do vary in terms of the number of applications they receive per place. For instance, when I was the director of the Oxford course, we received over 40 applicants per place. However, regardless of which course they're applying for, it's important to bear in mind that in 9 out of 10 cases, the decision on whether the person progresses to clinical psychology training will be made at the shortlisting stage, where the only information available is what's on their form and what you write about them. Though, as I've said, what referees write often has a wider range than the other information on the application form. In my own experience, this is often a product more of the referee's knowledge of what the courses are looking for in terms of those references than it is of the applicants themselves, and it's for that reason that I've made these videos. The reference form asks about a number of specific competencies, and in most courses ratings of those competencies based on the reference form are used as part of the shortlisting decision-making process. So realistically, if you're rating an applicant low on those competencies, given the competitiveness of training, they really don't stand much chance of getting shortlisted. In that sense, I think the very term reference is slightly misleading as part of this process, and actually they function more as letters of recommendation. And if you're familiar with the US system of clinical psychology training, letters of recommendation form a part of that process. And I think the way that references are used in UK clinical training is effectively quite similar to that. One of the issues that comes up frequently with the academic reference is that the person who's being asked to write it has not had contact with the applicant for many years. This is almost inevitable because the courses ask for someone who can comment on the person's academic performance in an academic setting, but we also ask for relevant experience. So by the time the person's got that, they're some way from their university, certainly their first degree, and even often a master's degree if they've done that. This is not normally, this is not a big problem, and so I really would say don't be worried about writing a reference for someone who you've not seen for a few years. You'll be referring to notes that you've had from the time and previous references, and so you're commenting on an academic setting which is valuable to courses, particularly when applicants haven't been in academic settings for some time, so the reference will still be valuable. It can be helpful to refer, if you've been in touch with the applicant, and they may well have provided you with information about what they've done in the meantime. That can be helpful to allude to, but obviously you're not going to have direct experience of that, so I certainly wouldn't make that a significant part of the reference. The value is from your own comment on the applicant's performance in an academic setting. What I would say is that you'll notice the first question, or the early question on the form, is how well you know the applicant. If you feel that you don't know the applicant well, or you didn't have enough exposure to the applicant during the time that you did know them to tick anything other than the box that says I know them casually, then I think you need to go back to the applicant. It may well be that there's a sort of difference of perspective on how well you knew them, and they may well perhaps have a view that you knew them better than you did, because ideally it's preferable to have somebody who at least knows or knew the person well during that time. So I don't think it's a problem that you might be writing some years in retrospect, obviously as long as you're relying on notes, but it is a problem if you didn't know them well at that time, because again it's difficult for a course to put very much weight on a glowing reference that's written by someone who says that they didn't really know the person very well. It may, in those circumstances, the applicant might well approach somebody that they have more contact with. Sometimes applicants feel that they should approach the most senior person in the department, somebody who's got a name, well-known name. My view is that this is not a good strategy if that person doesn't know them as well as another member of the department. So again, you may well want to have a discussion with the applicant about that. If you've been nominated by an applicant to provide a reference, hopefully they will have discussed this with you beforehand, but the first thing you'll receive from the clearinghouse is this email, which invites you to click on the link to go to the submission page, and also gives you the date by which the reference is due. As you go on to the reference form itself, the first question you'll come across is asking you to say how many references you've ever written for clearinghouse applications. Now this might seem like a slightly strange question until you get on to the next one, which is asking you to rate the current applicant in relation to previous applicants who you've written references for. Now, in my opinion, this is the least valid question on the whole form, because firstly it depends on the size of the sample you have to rate, and also it assumes that each individual referee will have a similar type of sample to compare to. However, unless you've said that you haven't done any previous applications, then you'll be expected to make a rating on this form. I think that the one thing I would say is that you may, if you don't have much familiarity with the process, you might assumed that this rating would form a normal distribution with 3 as the mean. Now, I'm quite happy for people to provide data to show that that is the case, but in my own experience of looking at forms over many years, I would say the distribution is much more like this, with very few applicants not being rated 4 or 5. Now, clearly that's a logical impossibility, and I know that people in the training community would wish that it was the case and would encourage you to use all of the scale. However, the reality is that you're not going to be able to change the distribution of this rating based on your own rating. The only thing you're going to be able to change is the individual applicant's chances of getting shortlisted. So I would urge you to be very cautious about rating an applicant less than 4 or 5 unless you really do think that they're not suitable for clinical psychology training. The next questions you'll come to are competency rating questions, and there are 3 on the academic reference, each that are rated from 1 to 5. Now, given that these aren't asking you to rate in comparison to previous applicants, but rather low to high, there's no reason to expect that the distribution would have a mean of 3, and certainly in my experience most applicants again are rated towards the top of the scale. The clearinghouse notes actually ask you to give an explanation if you're rating someone 3 or lower. The next question you'll come to is asking you to make an overall judgment of the candidate's ability to complete a clinical psychology training course. Now, this is a difficult question for academic referees to answer, particularly if they're not familiar with clinical psychology training or haven't seen the applicant for some time. All I would say is that there's some notes in the clearinghouse information about the demands of a clinical psychology training program. Certainly all UK courses are at doctoral level, but I would again stress that most applicants are rated in the top 2 of these responses, and if you did think that you need to rate the applicant lower than that, then I'd certainly encourage you to discuss that with them before you agree to be a referee. The next thing you'll come to is free text responses. There's 4 of these in the academic reference. I won't read through them all. There's some guidance in the notes that encourages you to give enough detail to be meaningful, but not huge amounts, because bear in mind when we're shortlisting we're reading many of these forms. It's very helpful to give specific examples. So I'm just going to give some examples for this question on rating the applicant's ability to apply their academic knowledge. Now, my heart sinks when a referee writes a very brief statement, even if it's a very brief positive statement, very good, excellent, outstanding. It really doesn't give the rater anything to go on, so that kind of response is not going to be helpful to the applicant at all. Another type of response that's not very helpful at all is one that gives a lot of information, but information about the context rather than the applicant themselves. So it's surprising how common these are, but people often go on about the details of the research the person's done, wider aspects of the research, but really tell you not very much about the applicant themselves, so that's not very helpful. What is helpful is to say quite specifically what the applicant's done and what kind of competencies they've used to do it. Now, my example, I've gone a little bit over the top here, but an applicant doesn't need to, no expectation that they've done Nobel Prize winning research at their undergraduate level, but what is really helpful is just explaining a bit about what they've done and their own contribution, because that obviously gives the rater something to go on. So that's a helpful kind of response. Now, I've mentioned that if an applicant is rated low on the competencies that are being assessed by their referee, they stand little chance of being shortlisted because of the competitive nature and because of the significant investment that the NHS puts into this training and the nature of the work. However, I want to be very clear that what I'm not suggesting is that you give an inaccurate reference. It's obviously really important that referees, because of the way the references are used, form a part of the selection process, and you as a referee have a responsibility to provide an accurate reference. However, I think it's important for you to be aware of the way that the references are used, and if you are going to rate an applicant low on any of the competencies, I would suggest that you discuss that with the applicant before you submit your reference. So that brings us to the end of this short video. It just remains for me to say thank you for watching, and also thank you for the important role that you're playing in clinical psychology training by providing a reference for an applicant. Thank you and goodbye.